Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a story that everyone in history should know. The story is, why did Vikings survive while medieval Europe was dying? You get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Why did Vikings survive while medieval Europe was dying? The world that was falling apart. The year is somewhere in the early Middle Ages. Across Europe, the morning begins not with hope, but with uncertainty. The first rays of sunlight creep over villages surrounded by muddy fields, thick forests, and crumbling wooden fences. Smoke rises from tiny cottages where families have spent another freezing night, wondering if the food stored for winter will last until spring. In many places, it will not. Life in medieval Europe is brutally unpredictable. A single failed harvest can condemn an entire village to starvation. A harsh winter can kill livestock that took years to raise. A contagious disease can wipe out half a town before anyone understands what is happening. Lords fight neighboring lords over land. Kings struggle to hold their kingdoms together, and ordinary people pay the price for conflicts they never chose. For countless families, survival depends entirely on the land beneath their feet. Wheat, barley, oats, and rye are not simply crops. They are the difference between life and death. If rain comes too early, too late, or not at all, hunger follows. There are no supermarkets, no emergency food supplies, no government relief programs. Nature decides who survives. Yet while much of Europe lives on this fragile edge, another society is growing stronger far to the north. Scandinavia is a land unlike any other. Mountains slice through the landscape. Deep fjords cut into the coastline like giant scars left by ancient glaciers. Thick forests stretch for hundreds of miles, while rocky soil challenges anyone attempting to farm. Winters are long, dark, and bitterly cold. Snow covers the ground for months. The sea crashes relentlessly against the cliffs, reminding everyone that nature is always stronger than mankind. At first glance, this seems like the worst possible place to build a civilization. But appearances can be deceiving. The people who live here never expect life to be easy. Unlike many kingdoms farther south, they grow up knowing that hardship is normal. Every child learns that tomorrow's survival depends on today's preparation. Every family stores food months before winter arrives. Every community understands that cooperation is not optional. It is essential. This mindset changes everything. Instead of depending on one source of food, Viking communities diversify. They farm where they can. They hunt deer, elk, seals, and birds. They fish the rivers, lakes, and open sea. They gather berries, mushrooms, herbs, and edible plants during the brief Scandinavian summers. If one food source fails, another often remains available. This flexibility becomes one of their greatest strengths. Meanwhile, many parts of medieval Europe become increasingly dependent on agriculture alone. When crops fail repeatedly, entire regions collapse into famine. Desperate people abandon villages, crime increases, disease spreads more easily among weakened populations, and political instability follows. The Vikings face harsh weather too. They experience failed harvests, they lose livestock, they endure freezing winters. But their society has already been built around the expectation that disaster will come sooner or later. That difference, expecting hardship instead of fearing it, creates a remarkable resilience. Imagine waking before sunrise on a Scandinavian farm around the 9th century. The house is built from thick timber, designed to trap heat. A fire has burned through the night inside the longhouse, keeping both people and animals alive despite freezing temperatures outside. Sheep and goats may even be sheltered within the same structure during winter, their body heat helping warm the building. Every object inside the home serves a purpose. Nothing is wasted. Clothing is carefully repaired instead of discarded. Tools are maintained for decades. Wood is saved. Food scraps feed animals. Animal bones become needles, hooks, or tools. Leather is reused until it can no longer hold together. This culture values efficiency because survival demands it. Children begin learning practical skills almost as soon as they can walk. Boys and girls alike help gather firewood, care for animals, prepare food, repair fishing nets, and assist during harvest season. Knowledge passes naturally from one generation to the next. There are no classrooms. Life itself is the teacher. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Europe, social systems often separate nobles from peasants so completely that practical knowledge remains trapped within individual communities. Many peasants rarely travel beyond neighboring villages during their entire lives. The Vikings think differently. Travel becomes part of life. The sea is not a terrifying obstacle, it is an opportunity. Rivers become highways. Coastlines become roads. Ships become bridges connecting distant cultures. This single innovation transforms Scandinavian society forever. Long before famous Viking raids begin, generations of shipbuilders spend centuries perfecting vessels capable of crossing dangerous waters. Every improvement matters. A lighter hull, a stronger keel, a better sail, a more flexible design. Each innovation expands the distance people can travel. With greater travel comes greater trade. With trade comes wealth. With wealth comes security. While isolated villages elsewhere struggle alone during difficult years, Viking settlements often maintain connections stretching across enormous distances. If one region experiences shortages, another may still have supplies. Trade softens disaster. This interconnected world gives Scandinavia an unexpected advantage. Iron from one region, furs from another, amber from the Baltic, silver from the east, salt from distant markets, glass from foreign craftsmen. Every voyage increases the possibilities for survival. Of course, life remains dangerous. Storms destroy ships. Sea ice traps fishermen. Bandits attack travelers. Disease exists here too. But Viking society constantly adapts instead of remaining fixed. Their leaders are expected to prove themselves through action rather than inherited titles alone. Communities gather at assemblies where disputes are debated and settled. Decisions often involve negotiation rather than simple commands from above. These traditions strengthen local cooperation. No society is perfect. The Vikings fight among themselves. Blood feuds erupt. Power struggles divide families. Violence remains common. Yet even conflict follows cultural rules designed to prevent complete social collapse. Honor matters, reputation matters, promises matter. Trust becomes a valuable currency. Without trust, trade fails. Without trade, survival becomes harder. As the centuries unfold, medieval Europe experiences repeated waves of political fragmentation. Empires collapse. Borders shift constantly. Entire kingdoms disappear from maps. The Vikings witnessed these same changes, but instead of becoming victims, many recognize opportunity. Where others see chaos, they see open trade routes, new settlements, rich markets, fresh farmland, and sometimes easy targets. The world is changing. Most people struggle simply to survive it. The Vikings learn how to use change itself as a weapon, and that may be the greatest secret behind why they endured while so many others around them seemed to be falling apart. The land that taught people to survive. If someone from the fertile plains of medieval France or England had traveled to Scandinavia for the first time, they probably would have wondered why anyone chose to live there at all. The mountains seemed endless. The forests were so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground in some places. Massive cliffs dropped into deep blue fjords carved by glaciers thousands of years earlier. Much of the soil was rocky, uneven, and difficult to cultivate. During winter, snow buried entire landscapes beneath a silent white blanket, while freezing winds swept in from the North Atlantic without mercy. It was beautiful, but beauty alone could never keep a family alive. The Vikings understood something that many outsiders did not. They knew they could never force nature to obey them. Instead, they learned to live with it. Every generation inherited not only land, but also centuries of practical knowledge about how to survive in one of Europe's harshest environments. A Viking farmer never assumed that the coming harvest would be generous. Hope was never considered a strategy. Preparation was. As soon as spring arrived, every member of the household became busy. Fields had to be cleared of stones that winter frost had pushed to the surface. Wooden fences damaged by snow and ice needed repair before livestock could wander away. Fishing boats damaged by storms had to be patched. Nets full of holes were patiently repaired by hand. Nothing waited until tomorrow if it could be done today. Time itself was a valuable resource. The Scandinavian summer was painfully short. Every warm day mattered. Every hour of sunlight had to be used wisely because everyone knew the long winter was already on its way. Children worked alongside adults from an early age. They collected berries in the forests, gathered firewood, watched sheep grazing on hillsides, and learned which wild plants were safe to eat. These lessons were not hobbies or entertainment. One mistake could mean poisoning an entire family. One forgotten task could mean freezing when winter arrived. Responsibility came early because survival demanded maturity long before adulthood. Women played a central role in this world. While many men traveled for trade, exploration, or warfare, women often managed farms, livestock, food supplies, and family property. Running a Viking household required intelligence, planning, and authority. A poorly managed home could collapse within a single winter, regardless of how successful its warriors were abroad. Food preservation became almost an art. Fresh meat spoiled quickly. Fish could not last forever. Milk turned sour. The Vikings solved these problems with methods perfected over generations. Fish were dried in the cold northern air. Meat was smoked above slow-burning fires. Salt preserved valuable supplies. Cheese and butter extended the usefulness of milk. Grain was carefully stored in dry buildings, protected from moisture and rodents. Every successful harvest was transformed into food that might still be edible many months later. Nothing was taken for granted. Even the forests surrounding Viking settlements became enormous storehouses filled with valuable resources. Trees provided timber for houses, ships, furniture, tools, and firewood. Animal hides became clothing and armor. Bones became needles and combs. Antlers became handles for knives. Even ash from fireplaces could be used in everyday life. Waste was a luxury few people could afford. The sea offered another lifeline, while farmers farther south often depended almost entirely on crops. Viking communities looked toward rivers, lakes, and oceans. Cod, herring, salmon, trout, whales stranded along the shore, seals resting on rocky islands. The water was never simply scenery, it was another field waiting to be harvested. Experienced fishermen understood the changing seasons almost instinctively. They knew where fish gathered when migration occurred, and how weather patterns affected their chances of success. These skills passed from fathers and mothers to children through years of observation rather than written books. Knowledge lived inside people, not inside libraries. This made Viking society surprisingly adaptable. If one family lost livestock, neighbors often helped. If storms destroyed a fishing boat, skilled craftsmen worked together to repair it. If winter proved especially severe, communities relied upon cooperation instead of isolation. Life was difficult enough without refusing to help each other. It did not mean Viking society was peaceful. Arguments happened, land disputes occurred, blood feuds sometimes lasted generations. But even conflict existed within a broader understanding that communities could not survive if everyone became enemies. Balance mattered, justice mattered, reputation mattered. A person known for breaking promises soon discovered that no one wished to trade, cooperate, or sail alongside them. Trust became another form of wealth. Meanwhile, much of medieval Europe struggled under rigid social systems. Many peasants remained tied to land owned by powerful nobles. Opportunities for change were limited. Movement between social classes was rare. Innovation often spread slowly. In contrast, Scandinavian society rewarded ability in practical ways. A skilled shipbuilder earned respect. A talented blacksmith became valuable. An experienced navigator could transform the fortunes of an entire community. Skill carried weight. Experience created opportunity. The Vikings also accepted risk as part of everyday life. Crossing dangerous seas was risky. Exploring unknown rivers was risky. Trading with distant strangers was risky. But refusing every risk often meant remaining poor forever. This willingness to embrace calculated danger separated them from many of their neighbors. Each voyage increased knowledge. Each successful expedition expanded trade. Each new settlement reduced pressure on limited farmland back home. Gradually, Scandinavia became connected to places that most medieval Europeans could hardly imagine. The British Isles, the Baltic coast, the rivers of Eastern Europe, the Frankish kingdoms, even lands stretching toward the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. Every journey brought home more than silver. Travelers returned with ideas, new technologies, different farming methods, foreign languages, unusual crafts, fresh perspectives. Knowledge became another valuable import. Over time, Viking society evolved not because it rejected outside influence, but because it absorbed useful ideas wherever they were found. That flexibility became one of its greatest strengths. History often remembers the Vikings because of their raids. But raids alone could never have sustained generations of people. Behind every famous warrior stood farmers producing grain, fishermen bringing home food, blacksmiths forging tools, women managing households, craftsmen building ships, merchants negotiating trades, and children learning the skills that would one day keep the next generation alive. The real foundation of Viking survival was never the sword. It was preparation. It was adaptability. It was the understanding that nature cared nothing for human pride. Only those willing to learn from it would endure. And soon, those lessons would carry the Vikings far beyond the shores of Scandinavia into a world that was completely unprepared for what was coming. The ships that changed the world. For thousands of years, the sea had divided civilizations. To most people living in medieval Europe, the ocean represented danger. It was a place of violent storms, hidden rocks, unpredictable tides, and endless uncertainty. Crossing large bodies of water was something done only when absolutely necessary, and even then, many travelers believed they were placing their lives entirely in God's hands. The Vikings looked at the same sea and saw something completely different. They saw a possibility. To them, the water was not a barrier separating nations. It was a road leading to places where opportunities waited beyond the horizon. That difference in perspective would change history forever. The ability to build extraordinary ships did not appear overnight. It was the result of centuries of experimentation, observation, failure, and improvement. Every generation of Scandinavian craftsmen left behind small innovations that the next generation refined even further. A stronger frame, a lighter hull, better balance, improved sails, more efficient oars. Each advancement seemed small on its own. Together they created one of the greatest technological achievements of the medieval world. Building a Viking ship demanded remarkable skill. It began deep inside the forests, where master craftsmen searched for the perfect trees. Not every oak could become part of a ship. The wood had to be strong yet flexible, capable of surviving violent waves without breaking apart. The shape of each tree mattered. Its age mattered. Even the direction in which it had grown could determine whether it became part of the keel, the ribs, or the planks. Nothing was chosen by chance. Once the timber was cut, months of careful work followed. Iron nails held overlapping wooden planks together in a method now known as clinker construction. This design made the ships both strong and surprisingly flexible. Instead of resisting the sea, they moved with it. When giant waves struck, the hull bent slightly rather than cracking under pressure. That flexibility often meant the difference between survival and disaster. The keel formed the backbone of every vessel. Long and narrow, it allowed the ship to cut cleanly through rough water while remaining stable even in difficult conditions. Above it rose a mast supporting a large, square sail woven from wool. When the wind favored them, the Vikings could travel vast distances without exhausting themselves at the oars. When the wind failed, dozens of rowers worked together with remarkable discipline, propelling the ship forward one stroke at a time. Every movement required coordination. Every sailor trusted the rhythm of the crew. No single person could cross the ocean alone. The ship itself became a floating community. Everyone had responsibilities. Some watched the weather, others navigated, some repaired ropes, others cooked food or maintained weapons. Experienced sailors constantly studied the sky, the wind, the movement of birds, and the behavior of the waves. Nature was their map. Long before compasses became common in Europe, Viking navigators developed extraordinary observational skills. They memorized coastlines, recognized mountain peaks from incredible distances, studied the position of the sun, watch stars during clear nights. Even the color of the water could reveal hidden dangers or nearby land. Knowledge accumulated over countless voyages became their greatest navigation tool. Every successful expedition expanded that knowledge even further. Unlike many medieval kingdoms whose influence ended at their borders, the Vikings built connections stretching across enormous regions. One voyage might lead west toward the British Isles. Another followed rivers deep into Eastern Europe. Others crossed the North Atlantic toward Iceland and Greenland. Each expedition brought back more than treasure. It brought information, new trade partners, fresh ideas, unknown resources, different cultures. The sea transformed isolated Scandinavian communities into participants in an international network, unlike anything their ancestors could have imagined. Trade flourished. Silver coins from distant Islamic lands appeared in Viking settlements. Fine silk from Byzantium reached northern Europe. Glassware, jewelry, spices, wine, and exotic goods found their way into Scandinavian markets. In return, the Vikings exported furs, walrus ivory, amber, iron, timber, honey, wax, and beautifully crafted weapons. Wealth no longer depended solely upon local harvests. The entire known world became a marketplace. This gave Viking society remarkable economic resilience. If farming suffered during one season, trade might compensate. If local resources became scarce, foreign markets offered alternatives. Diversification strengthened survival. Meanwhile, many inland communities elsewhere in Europe remained dependent almost entirely upon nearby resources. Isolation increased vulnerability. Connection reduced it. Of course, these magnificent ships also carried warriors. History remembers terrifying attacks on monasteries and coastal towns because they were sudden, fast, and devastating. The famous raid on Lindisfarne shocked Christian Europe. Communities that had believed the sea protected them suddenly discovered that danger could arrive with the morning tide. The speed of Viking ships made defense incredibly difficult. They could appear unexpectedly, strike quickly, leave before organized resistance formed. But even these raids depended upon the same technology that supported peaceful trade. The same ship carrying merchants one season might transport warriors the next. The vessel itself was simply a tool. How it was used depended upon circumstance. This flexibility became another defining feature of Viking society. The people of Scandinavia rarely limited themselves to a single occupation. A farmer could become a sailor. A merchant might fight when necessary. A craftsman could join an expedition. Many individuals shifted between roles depending upon opportunity and need. Life demanded versatility. Specialization existed, but adaptability mattered even more. Every voyage carried risks. Storms could appear without warning. Dense fog might hide dangerous rocks. Powerful currents threatened to pull ships far from their intended routes. Food sometimes spoiled. Fresh water occasionally ran low. Disease spread easily aboard crowded vessels. Death was never far away, yet fear rarely prevented departure. The Vikings understood a simple truth. Remaining safely at home carried dangers too. Poor harvests, limited land, growing populations, harsh winters. Sometimes staying behind was the greater risk. So they kept sailing. They crossed rivers no one expected them to navigate. They reached islands few Europeans had ever seen. They established settlements in places that seemed impossible to inhabit. With every generation, their understanding of the wider world expanded. Children grew up hearing stories not only of nearby villages but of distant kingdoms, frozen seas, rich cities, and lands where the sun behaved differently from what they knew. Curiosity became part of their culture. The horizon was never the end of the world. It was simply the beginning of another journey. While many medieval societies focused on protecting what they already possessed, the Vikings constantly searched for what lay beyond. That mindset would carry them farther than almost anyone believed possible. Soon their ships would reach lands separated by hundreds, even thousands, of miles from Scandinavia. And those discoveries would prove that survival sometimes belongs not to the strongest, but to those willing to keep sailing when everyone else turns back. Why the Vikings were never just raiders. If history had been written only by the Vikings themselves, the world might remember them very differently. Today, the image that immediately comes to mind is often that of fierce warriors stepping onto foreign shores with axes in their hands and fire behind them. Monasteries burning, villages fleeing, kings scrambling to organize their defenses. It is an image that has survived for centuries because it is dramatic, unforgettable, and repeated countless times in books, films, and television. But it is also incomplete. The vast majority of Vikings were never full-time warriors. Most were ordinary people. They were farmers who woke before sunrise to tend their livestock. They were fishermen who spent long hours battling cold northern waters. They were blacksmiths whose hammers echoed through small villages from morning until evening. They were shipbuilders, traders, craftsmen, hunters, weavers, woodcarvers, and parents trying to raise children in one of Europe's harshest environments. Raiding was only one part of a much larger way of life. For many young men, joining a raiding expedition was not simply about violence, it was an opportunity. Scandinavia had limited farmland. As generations passed, families grew larger while the amount of productive land remained almost the same. See, inheritance often divided farms into smaller and smaller pieces until supporting every family member became increasingly difficult. Some people searched for another solution. They looked outward. The sea offered possibilities that the land could not. A successful voyage could return with silver, valuable goods, livestock, weapons, or enough wealth to purchase land back home. It was dangerous, but so was remaining trapped in poverty. Risk became an investment. Not every expedition involved attacking anyone. Many Viking ships sailed peacefully from one trading settlement to another. Markets along the Baltic Sea buzzed with merchants speaking different languages. Scandinavian traders exchanged furs, amber, iron, walrus ivory, honey, and slaves for silver coins, silk, glassware, spices, and finely crafted goods from distant civilizations. Some voyages earned fortunes without drawing a single sword. Trade became as important as conquest. The Vikings quickly realized something many rulers overlooked. Destroying a prosperous town might provide wealth once. Trading with it could provide wealth for generations. This practical way of thinking shaped many of their decisions. If peaceful exchange proved more profitable than conflict, they chose peace. If resistance was weak and riches seemed plentiful, they sometimes chose war. They adapted to circumstances instead of following rigid rules. This flexibility helped explain why Viking influence spread so rapidly. In England, some arrived as raiders. Others stayed as settlers. They built farms, raised families, established communities. Over time, former enemies became neighbors. Children born in these settlements often spoke different languages than their grandparents. Cultures blended together in ways no one had expected. The same pattern appeared elsewhere. In Ireland, Viking settlements developed into thriving towns. Places like Dublin began as Viking bases before growing into important centers of commerce. Merchants from many lands gathered there to exchange goods from across Europe and beyond. Trade routes became lifelines connecting north and south, east and west. These towns generated wealth long after individual raids had been forgotten. The Vikings understood that permanent settlements created stability. A successful farm produced food every year. A busy marketplace attracted merchants repeatedly. A growing town increased opportunities for craftsmen and traders alike. Building often became more valuable than destroying. This practical mindset also influenced their leadership. A successful Viking leader needed more than courage in battle. He had to distribute wealth fairly enough to keep followers loyal. He needed diplomatic skill when negotiating alliances. He required judgment when deciding whether trade or warfare offered greater rewards. Leadership depended upon results. Empty promises accomplished little. Reputation spread quickly across Scandinavia. A leader known for wisdom attracted followers. One known for greed often lost them. Loyalty had to be earned repeatedly. That expectation encouraged competence. At home, daily life continued regardless of distant expeditions. Fields still required planting. Animals still needed care. Children continued learning practical skills from parents and grandparents. Communities functioned because ordinary people fulfilled ordinary responsibilities. Without them, no expedition could ever leave the harbor. The economy supporting Viking expansion rested upon countless unnoticed acts of labor. Someone forged every nail holding ships together. Someone spun every sail. Someone carved every oar. Someone raised every sheep whose wool became clothing. Someone harvested every field, feeding the crews before departure. Great achievements often depended upon invisible work. The Vikings understood this. Success belonged to entire communities, not only to famous warriors. Religion also shaped their worldview. They believed the gods valued courage, honor, loyalty, and determination. Death was accepted as an unavoidable part of life rather than something to fear constantly. This belief encouraged confidence during dangerous voyages. No sailor could control the weather. No warrior could guarantee survival. What mattered was meeting uncertainty with resolve. Such attitudes strengthened morale during difficult times. Meanwhile, many parts of medieval Europe struggled with internal divisions. Political rivalries weakened kingdoms. Local conflicts drained resources. Communication between distant regions remained slow. The Vikings often exploited these weaknesses. They rarely attacked powerful united enemies directly. Instead, they observed carefully. They struck where defenses were weakest. They chose timing wisely. Preparation often mattered more than numbers. A smaller force with better planning could overwhelm a larger but disorganized opponent. This strategic thinking extended beyond warfare. The Vikings constantly gathered information. Travelers returned with stories. Merchants reported political changes. Explorers described coastlines and rivers. Knowledge became another valuable resource. The more they understood the world, the more effectively they could operate within it. That habit of learning from every journey gave them advantages impossible to achieve through strength alone. As years passed, the Vikings became something far greater than raiders. They became explorers who reached unknown lands, merchants connecting distant civilizations, settlers establishing entirely new communities, craftsmen spreading technology, navigators expanding humanity's understanding of geography. Their legacy was written not only with swords, but with ships, markets, homes, roads, and ideas that traveled farther than any army ever could. While much of medieval Europe struggled simply to endure the challenges surrounding it, the Vikings kept asking one question that changed everything. What lies beyond the horizon? That curiosity would soon carry them farther west than anyone in Europe had ever imagined. The secret of Viking adaptability. History often celebrates the strongest armies, the richest kingdoms, or the most powerful kings. But when historians look closely at the Vikings, they discover something far more important than military strength. The real secret behind Viking survival was adaptability. The world around them never stood still, and neither did they. Every generation faced new challenges. Some years brought heavy snowfall that buried farms beneath ice for months. Other years delivered poor harvests that threatened entire communities with hunger. Storms destroyed fishing boats, livestock died from disease, rival chieftains fought over land and influence. No family escaped hardship forever. Yet instead of believing disaster meant the end, the Vikings treated every crisis as a problem waiting to be solved. This way of thinking shaped their entire society. A farmer whose crops failed did not simply wait for better weather. He might spend more time fishing. He might hunt in nearby forests. He could trade with neighboring settlements or join a seasonal expedition to earn silver. His family looked for alternatives because depending on a single source of survival was considered dangerous. Flexibility became a habit. Even the houses reflected this philosophy. A Viking longhouse was not built to impress visitors. It was built to endure. Thick timber walls kept out freezing winds. Roofs covered with turf provided insulation against the cold. At the center of the building, a long fire burned almost constantly, filling the air with smoke that slowly escaped through openings above. The smoke preserved wooden beams, dried meat hanging from the ceiling, and helped keep insects away. Everything inside the house had more than one purpose. Benches became beds at night. Storage chests doubled as seats. Animal skins served as blankets, clothing, and trading goods. Nothing existed without reason. This practical mindset extended to clothing as well. Scandinavian winters showed no mercy. Warm garments were essential. Women spun wool into thread using drop spindles before weaving it into thick fabric. Leather boots were repaired repeatedly instead of being thrown away. Fur-lined cloaks protected travelers from icy winds during long journeys across mountains or open seas. Looking presentable mattered far less than staying alive. Children learned this lesson naturally. From an early age, they watched adults solve problems with whatever resources were available. If a tool broke, someone repaired it. If wood became scarce, it was used more carefully. If food supplies ran low, everyone adjusted. Complaining changed nothing. Action changed everything. This attitude created generations of people who expected life to be difficult and therefore rarely panicked when difficulties appeared. Knowledge also traveled remarkably fast through Viking communities. A successful farming technique discovered in one region spread to others through trade and travel. Shipbuilders shared improvements with fellow craftsmen. Blacksmiths experimented with better methods of forging iron. Experienced navigators taught younger sailors the safest routes through dangerous waters. There were no universities in Scandinavia during the Viking Age. Yet education happened constantly. It simply looked different. Instead of classrooms, there were workshops. Instead of textbooks, there was experience. Instead of examinations, there was survival. If a new idea worked, people remembered it. If it failed, they learned from the mistake. This willingness to experiment gave Viking society a significant advantage. Many medieval kingdoms relied heavily upon tradition. Practices continued simply because they had always been done that way. The Vikings respected tradition too, but they were less afraid to change when change offered clear benefits. That flexibility appeared most clearly during their voyages. A Viking expedition rarely followed a rigid plan. Weather could force sudden changes. Unexpected enemies might appear. New trading opportunities could emerge. A crew had to make decisions quickly. Success depended upon adapting faster than circumstances changed. This mentality eventually shaped their expansion across Europe. Some groups established peaceful trading settlements. Others accepted invitations to serve foreign rulers as warriors. Many became farmers in newly settled lands. They adjusted their way of life according to local conditions instead of insisting everything remain exactly as it had been in Scandinavia. Because of this, Viking influence blended with local cultures rather than replacing them entirely. In Normandy, Scandinavian settlers gradually adopted the local language while preserving elements of their own traditions. In England, Viking customs mixed with Anglo-Saxon practices. In Ireland, Norse merchants became part of growing urban communities. Rather than remaining outsiders forever, many Vikings became part of the societies they entered. Adaptation created survival, survival created opportunity, opportunity created lasting influence. The same pattern appeared inside Viking families. Not every son became a warrior. Not every daughter remained on a farm. Some became traders. Others became skilled artisans. Some traveled across continents. Others spent their entire lives in one village. Different paths were accepted because every role strengthened the community in its own way. The Vikings understood that no society could survive if everyone tried to do the same thing. Diversity of skills created resilience. One person understood metal, another understood ships. Someone else knew medicinal plants. Another possessed remarkable negotiating skills. Together, they formed communities capable of solving problems that no individual could face alone. Even their famous courage was closely connected to adaptability. People often imagine bravery as the absence of fear. The Vikings likely understood it differently. Fear existed, storms were frightening, battles were terrifying. Crossing unknown oceans demanded enormous courage. Real bravery meant continuing despite uncertainty. Again and again, Viking crews sailed toward horizons where no one could promise what waited beyond. Sometimes they found wealth, sometimes fertile land, sometimes powerful enemies, sometimes nothing at all. Yet they continued exploring because they believed possibility outweighed fear. That belief became one of the defining characteristics of their civilization. While much of medieval Europe struggled to preserve what already existed, the Vikings constantly searched for what might exist next. New routes, new markets, new alliances, new homes, new futures. This relentless ability to adapt did more than help them survive harsh Scandinavian winters. It prepared them for something no European people had ever attempted before, a voyage across an ocean so vast that many believed nothing lay beyond it. Soon, Viking ships would disappear over the western horizon and return with stories that sounded almost impossible to believe. The call of the unknown. Every civilization has a boundary. For many people in medieval Europe, that boundary was invisible, but everyone knew it existed. Beyond a certain point, the roads disappeared. The maps became uncertain. Stories replaced facts. Rumors replaced knowledge. The unknown belonged to monsters, legends, and mysteries that few people dared to challenge. The Vikings thought differently. To them, an empty horizon was not something to fear. It was an invitation. Growing up in Scandinavia meant becoming familiar with uncertainty from an early age. A fisherman never knew exactly what the sea would bring. A farmer could not predict the weather. A merchant crossing distant waters understood that every journey carried risks that no amount of preparation could completely eliminate. Life itself was uncertain. Because uncertainty was already part of everyday existence, exploring unknown places did not seem impossible. It simply seemed like the next step. As Viking ships ventured farther from home, they gradually began connecting places that had never before been linked so closely. One expedition followed the rivers of Eastern Europe. Another crossed the North Sea. Others sailed into waters that seemed endless. Every successful voyage pushed the limits of what people believed possible. These explorers did not possess modern maps. They had no satellite navigation, no magnetic compass guiding every movement. Instead, they depended upon generations of accumulated experience. They studied the stars whenever clouds allowed. They observed the position of the rising and setting sun. They noticed how waves reflected distant coastlines long before land became visible. They watched seabirds carefully. Certain birds rarely traveled far from land. Seeing them often meant that a coastline was somewhere beyond the horizon. Even whales became unexpected guides. Experienced sailors understood that some species followed predictable migration routes. Nature itself became their navigator. Cloud formations offered clues. Ocean currents carried hidden messages. The smell of vegetation drifting across the water sometimes announced land before anyone could actually see it. The Vikings paid attention to details that others ignored. Observation became survival. This remarkable awareness allowed them to travel astonishing distances across waters that frightened many other sailors of the time. Each voyage demanded patience. Weeks could pass with nothing visible except water and sky. Storms appeared without warning. Powerful winds snapped sails. Massive waves crashed across wooden decks. Ice floated silently through northern seas like enormous drifting mountains. Every expedition tested human endurance. Food had to be carefully rationed. Fresh water remained precious. Repairs often took place while the ship continued moving through rough seas. Everyone worked. No passenger simply watched. Every member of the crew contributed. Some adjusted sails. Others bailed water. Some prepared meals. Others kept constant watch for changing weather. The survival of everyone depended upon the efforts of each individual. This created extraordinary discipline, not because someone demanded it, because nature required it. Failure to cooperate endangered everyone. As their confidence grew, the Vikings reached islands that few Europeans had ever imagined. The Faroe Islands became stepping stones across the North Atlantic. Later came Iceland. At first glance, Iceland hardly seemed welcoming. Volcanoes dominated the landscape. Hot springs erupted unexpectedly. Long winters covered much of the island in snow. Strong winds swept across open plains almost constantly. Yet to Viking settlers, it represented something priceless. Opportunity. There was land available, rivers filled with fish, pastures suitable for sheep, resources waiting for people willing to work hard enough to use them. Instead of seeing obstacles, they saw possibilities. Families established farms. Communities slowly formed. Laws were created. Trade developed. Within a relatively short period, Iceland transformed from an isolated island into a thriving Norse society. This achievement demonstrated something remarkable. The Vikings did not merely visit new places, they learned how to live there. That distinction changed history. Many civilizations explored. Far fewer successfully settled distant lands. The Vikings possessed both curiosity and practical knowledge. Those qualities allowed them to transform exploration into expansion. But curiosity rarely stops once it begins. As more sailors crossed the North Atlantic, stories circulated about land lying even farther west. Perhaps they were only rumors. Perhaps drifting sailors had glimpsed distant coastlines before storms forced them away. Perhaps curious explorers simply wondered what existed beyond the next horizon. Whatever the reason, someone eventually decided to continue sailing, farther than anyone before. Beyond familiar waters, beyond known settlements, beyond certainty itself. The voyage demanded courage, unlike anything experienced previously. If no land existed ahead, supplies might run out long before the crew returned home. Storms could push ships hopelessly off course. There would be no nearby settlements offering help, only endless ocean. Still, they sailed. History often celebrates kings who conquered kingdoms. But there is another kind of courage. The courage to leave behind everything familiar without knowing whether success or disaster waits ahead. That courage carried Viking ships westward. Generation after generation, they refused to believe the edge of the known world marked the end of possibility. And eventually, their determination rewarded them with one of the greatest discoveries of the medieval age. A vast new coastline, unlike anything they had seen before. Rich forests, wild rivers, abundant wildlife. A land that existed centuries before Christopher Columbus would ever begin his famous voyage. The Vikings had reached North America, not through accident alone, but through centuries of preparation, generations of shipbuilding, countless dangerous expeditions, endless observation, relentless adaptability. The same qualities that had allowed them to survive harsh Scandinavian winters had now carried them across an entire ocean. Their story was no longer simply about surviving while medieval Europe struggled. It had become a story about expanding the limits of the human world itself. Yet even greater challenges still awaited them. Because discovering new land is one thing. Building a lasting future, there is something entirely different. When Europe was trapped, the Vikings kept moving. One of the greatest differences between the Vikings and much of medieval Europe was not strength. It was movement. Across large parts of medieval Europe, most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. A peasant might spend an entire lifetime farming the same fields, walking the same roads, attending the same church, and knowing only the neighboring villages. Travel was expensive, dangerous, and often unnecessary. For many, the world ended at the edge of familiar territory. The Vikings lived by a completely different rhythm. Movement was part of life. Every spring, when the ice melted and the sea became safer, the coastline came alive. Shipyards echoed with the sound of axes striking timber. Blacksmiths forged fresh nails and sharpened tools. Sailmakers repaired cloth worn by winter storms. Families carried supplies to the shore while experienced sailors inspected every plank, every rope, and every oar. The sea was waking up, and with it so were the Vikings. Not every ship sailed for war. Many left carrying merchants with valuable cargo packed tightly below deck. Bundles of fur collected during the long winter. Bars of iron, amber glowing like captured sunlight, honey stored inside wooden barrels, finely crafted weapons, beautiful carvings made from walrus ivory. Every item represented months of careful work. Every voyage represented opportunity. As ships departed, they followed routes that had become familiar over generations. Some headed toward England. Others crossed the Baltic Sea. Some entered the winding rivers of Eastern Europe, where ships were sometimes dragged over land between waterways before continuing their journey. The routes were difficult, but difficulty rarely discouraged the Vikings. Where others saw impossible obstacles, they searched for practical solutions. When rivers became too shallow, they carried their ships. When storms blocked one route, they found another. When trade shifted elsewhere, they adjusted. Flexibility remained their greatest weapon. This constant movement created something extraordinary. Information traveled almost as quickly as goods. A merchant arriving from distant lands brought far more than silver. He brought news, stories, warnings, rumors, political changes, new alliances, conflicts between kings, harvest failures, disease outbreaks. Everything became valuable information. Knowledge itself became a form of wealth. Imagine two communities. One knows only what happens within a few miles of home. The other receives news from hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Which one is better prepared for change? The Vikings understood the answer. They listened carefully. A merchant returning from England might describe political instability. A traveler from the Frankish kingdoms could report new markets, eager for northern goods. Someone arriving from the east might speak of growing trade opportunities along great rivers leading toward distant empires. Every conversation expanded their understanding of the world. This habit of collecting information made Viking society surprisingly aware of events far beyond Scandinavia. Meanwhile, many European kingdoms struggled with slow communication. Messages traveled on horseback over rough roads. Weeks passed before important news reached distant regions, sometimes months. By then, circumstances had already changed. The Vikings often learned quickly because their trade networks connected so many different places. Their ships became floating channels of communication. Movement also changed the way they thought about identity. A Viking merchant could meet Anglo-Saxons in England, Slavic traders along eastern rivers, Frankish nobles, Irish craftsmen, Arab merchants carrying silver, Byzantine officials dressed in magnificent robes. Every encounter exposed them to new ideas, new customs, new technologies, new opportunities. Unlike isolated societies that feared outside influence, the Vikings often absorbed useful knowledge regardless of where it came from. If someone built a better tool, they wanted to understand it. If another culture developed a more efficient trading method, they paid it attention. Learning was practical. Pride never filled an empty stomach. Results mattered far more than tradition alone. This willingness to learn helped explain why Viking society adapted so successfully to changing circumstances. Their settlements reflected this openness. Markets became places where languages mixed freely. Different styles of clothing appeared side by side. Foreign coins circulated alongside locally produced goods. Artisans experimented with unfamiliar techniques learned through trade. Scandinavia remained proudly Norse, but it never became isolated. Connection strengthened resilience. Movement also reduced one of Scandinavia's greatest problems: population pressure. Good farmland was limited. As families grew larger, finding enough land for future generations became increasingly difficult. Many societies facing this problem experienced growing conflict. The Vikings found another answer: expansion. Some families settled Iceland. Others established communities in Greenland. Some remained in England. Others created new lives in Normandy. Instead of forcing everyone to compete for the same limited resources, they created new opportunities elsewhere. Migration relieved pressure at home while spreading Viking influence across vast distances. This strategy did not eliminate hardship. New settlements faced their own dangers: harsh climates, unknown landscapes, conflicts with local populations, isolation. But the willingness to move meant stagnation rarely became permanent. Whenever one door closed, the Vikings searched for another. This mindset separated them from many of their contemporaries. Movement became survival, not because travel was easy, because remaining still sometimes proved even more dangerous. Every voyage reminded them that the world was larger than yesterday. Every new coastline challenged old assumptions. Every successful expedition proved that opportunity often existed just beyond fear. Perhaps that is why Viking history feels so remarkable even today. They refused to believe that the boundaries of their world were fixed. Every horizon invited another question: what lies beyond? And every answer inspired another journey. Yet, as Viking influence spread across Europe and beyond, something unexpected began to happen. The people once feared as outsiders slowly became part of the very civilizations they had once shocked. Their greatest legacy would not be the lands they raided, but the worlds they helped create. The power of Viking communities. When people imagine the Viking Age, they often picture a single warrior standing alone on the deck of a longship, gripping an axe as waves crash against the hull. It is a powerful image, but it is also misleading. No Viking survived alone. The real strength of Viking society was never the individual, it was the community. Every successful voyage, every thriving settlement, and every prosperous farm depended on people working together. One person's skill was valuable, but the combined knowledge of an entire village was what kept everyone alive through long winters and uncertain years. A Viking settlement was far more than a collection of houses. It was a network of relationships. Neighbors knew each other well. Families often worked side by side during planting season, helped repair damaged buildings after storms, and gathered together when important decisions had to be made. Life was too difficult for isolation, Cooperation became a necessity rather than a choice. During harvest time, every available pair of hands joined the work. Children carried bundles of grain. Older people sorted crops and prepared them for storage. Strong adults cut fields from sunrise until darkness. Nobody asked whether the work belonged to them personally. If the harvest failed, everyone suffered. If it succeeded, everyone benefited. The same spirit appeared whenever a new ship was being built. Constructing a Viking longship required hundreds of individual tasks. Woodcutters selected the right trees. Blacksmiths forged thousands of iron nails. Carpenters shaped each plank with remarkable precision. Rope makers twisted long strands strong enough to survive violent storms. Women often produced the enormous woolen sails that would eventually carry the ship across open seas. Each contribution mattered. Remove even one group from the process and the ship could never leave the shore. This understanding created mutual respect. Not every hero carried a sword. Many carried an axe used for cutting timber. Others held a hammer inside a forge. Some spent their lives weaving cloth. Others fished quietly along cold northern coasts. Together they built the foundation upon which every famous expedition depended. Leadership reflected this practical approach. A Viking chieftain was expected to protect his people, settle disputes, reward loyalty, and provide opportunities for prosperity. Power alone was not enough. A leader who consistently failed his followers eventually lost their support. Respect had to be earned. Generosity mattered. Wisdom mattered. Keeping promises mattered. A reputation built over many years could disappear after only a few poor decisions. Because communities remained relatively close-knit, everyone noticed how leaders behaved. Trust became one of the most valuable resources in Viking society. This sense of accountability influenced everyday life. Merchants depended on honest trading partners. Sailors relied on dependable crews. Farmers trusted neighbors to cooperate during difficult seasons. Even family alliances often stretched across different settlements, creating broader networks of support. When trouble arrived, people rarely faced it completely alone. The Vikings also developed legal traditions that encouraged order within their communities. Disagreements were inevitable. Arguments over land, inheritance, trade, or personal honor could easily turn violent if left unresolved. Instead of allowing endless revenge to destroy society, assemblies known as things gathered people together to settle disputes. These meetings became one of the most important institutions in the Viking world. Here, respected individuals listened to both sides of an argument. Witnesses spoke. Evidence was considered. Compromises were often reached before conflicts grew beyond control. Justice was imperfect. Powerful families still held influence. But the existence of such assemblies demonstrated something significant. The Vikings understood that stable communities required rules accepted by everyone. Without law, trust disappeared. Without trust, trade collapsed. Without trade, prosperity faded. Strong communities also depended upon shared traditions. Stories played a central role in preserving these traditions. During long winter nights, families gathered around the central fire inside the longhouse. Outside, snow covered the landscape. Inside, elders spoke. They told stories of brave explorers, wise leaders, great voyages, hard winters overcome through determination. These tales entertained children, but they also educated them. Every story carried lessons: courage, loyalty, patience, responsibility, adaptability. Young listeners learned not only who their ancestors had been, but also what kind of people they themselves were expected to become. History lived in memory long before it was written on parchment. These stories strengthened identity. A child growing up in such an environment understood that survival depended upon more than personal strength. It depended upon protecting the community, helping neighbors, honoring agreements, passing knowledge to the next generation. One generation prepared the next. That continuous transfer of experience became one of the greatest advantages Viking society possessed. Mistakes were remembered. Successful techniques were preserved. New ideas were added without forgetting old wisdom. Knowledge accumulated year after year. Meanwhile, many parts of medieval Europe experienced repeated cycles of destruction caused by war, famine, and political instability. Entire villages disappeared. Trade routes broke down. Communities fractured. The Vikings certainly faced hardship as well. But their social structure often allowed them to recover more quickly. When disaster struck, people already knew how to cooperate. They had practiced it all their lives. That resilience cannot be measured simply by counting battles won or territories conquered. It existed inside everyday relationships, inside shared responsibilities, inside ordinary acts of trust repeated thousands of times across generations. Perhaps that was the greatest strength of all. Because no civilization survives through warriors alone. It survives through families, neighbors, craftsmen, farmers, children willing to learn, and communities strong enough to endure when everything else begins to fall apart. Soon, however, these tightly connected Viking communities would encounter something that would gradually reshape every aspect of their world. A new faith, new kingdoms, and a new Europe that was beginning to emerge from the chaos of the early Middle Ages. When the Vikings changed instead of disappearing, many people believe the Viking Age ended because the Vikings were defeated. The truth is far more interesting. They did not simply vanish, they transformed. History is full of civilizations that disappear almost overnight. Some are destroyed by war. Others collapse because of famine, disease, or economic disaster. Entire cultures have faded until only ruins remain to tell their story. The Vikings followed a different path. Instead of disappearing, they adapted once again. That ability had always been their greatest strength. As the 10th and 11th centuries unfolded, Europe slowly began to change. Powerful kingdoms started becoming more organized. Kings built stronger governments. Stone castles replaced many wooden fortifications. Armies became larger and better coordinated. Christianity spread across northern Europe, bringing new beliefs, new laws, and new political alliances. The world that had once allowed small Viking fleets to strike almost anywhere was gradually becoming more difficult to navigate. Many societies would have resisted change until it destroyed them. The Vikings did not. They looked at the changing world and asked a familiar question. How do we adapt? The answer came in many different forms. Some Viking leaders accepted Christianity. This was not always a sudden rejection of old beliefs. For many communities, the transition happened gradually over several generations. Ancient traditions remained important. Old stories continued to be told. But churches began appearing where temples once stood. Crosses slowly replaced the symbols of the old gods. Children grew up learning different prayers than their grandparents. Religion changed, yet the people remained. Kings recognized another advantage. Joining Christian Europe created opportunities. Trade became easier, diplomatic relationships improved. Marriage alliances strengthened kingdoms. Foreign rulers became partners instead of permanent enemies. Accepting change often brought stability. The Vikings understood that survival sometimes required letting go of the past. This did not mean forgetting who they were. It meant building upon their history instead of becoming trapped by it. Scandinavia itself also changed. Small rival territories gradually united into larger kingdoms. Norway, Denmark, Sweden. Royal authority became stronger than it had been during the early Viking Age. Laws became more organized. Taxes became more regular. Local power slowly shifted toward centralized governments. Once again, Viking society adapted. Many warriors entered royal service. Experienced sailors became merchants. Shipbuilders continued improving their craft. Farmers expanded production. Trade flourished across the Baltic and North Seas. The skills developed during centuries of exploration remained valuable, even after large-scale raiding declined. The sea was still their greatest highway. Only the purpose of many voyages had changed. Instead of carrying warriors searching for treasure, increasing numbers of ships transported merchants, pilgrims, settlers, diplomats, and craftsmen. Commerce replaced conquest as the foundation of prosperity. This transition happened gradually. Not every raid ended overnight. Not every community changed at the same pace. History rarely moves in straight lines. Old traditions survived alongside new ones. Some families embraced Christianity quickly. Others held on to the old gods for decades. Some regions welcomed stronger kings. Others resisted. But overall, Scandinavia moved forward instead of remaining frozen in the past. This willingness to evolve separated the Vikings from civilizations that disappeared when circumstances changed. Adaptation once again became their greatest weapon. The descendants of Viking settlers also transformed the lands where they had settled. In Normandy, the descendants of Norse warriors eventually spoke French. They built castles, adopted local customs, became powerful nobles. Yet they never completely lost their Scandinavian roots. Generations later, one of their descendants would cross the English Channel in 1066. His name was William. History remembers him as William the Conqueror. The blood of Viking settlers now flowed through one of medieval Europe's most powerful rulers. In England, Scandinavian influence remained visible in language, law, and place names. Many everyday English words still carry traces of Old Norse. Entire regions preserved traditions shaped by Viking settlement long after the Viking Age officially ended. The same pattern appeared across Ireland, Scotland, Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. The Vikings no longer dominated headlines of medieval history through spectacular raids. Instead, they quietly became part of the societies they had once entered as outsiders. That may be the greatest sign of survival, not endless conquest, enduring influence. Cultures that survive for centuries rarely remain unchanged. They evolve, they borrow, they adapt, they rebuild. The Vikings understood this instinctively. Perhaps because life in Scandinavia had taught them long ago that resisting every change was impossible. Winter always arrived. Storms always came. Children always inherited a different world than their parents. Survival belonged to those willing to prepare for tomorrow rather than endlessly trying to preserve yesterday. That lesson carried them through centuries of uncertainty. It allowed them to endure while many medieval societies struggled under the weight of rigid traditions and repeated crises. Their ships eventually disappeared from history's battlefields. Their famous raids became memories. Their old religion faded, but the people remained. Their descendants continued building kingdoms, trading across oceans, exploring distant lands, writing stories, creating laws, shaping Europe in ways that are still visible today. The Viking Age may have ended, but the Viking legacy never truly did. The real reason the Vikings survived. When people ask why the Vikings survived while so much of medieval Europe seemed to be struggling, they often expect a simple answer. Perhaps it was because they were stronger. Perhaps because they were better warriors. Perhaps because they built faster ships. Those explanations contain a little truth, but none of them tell the whole story. The real answer is much deeper. The Vikings survived because they built a society that expected hardship, instead of pretending hardship would never come. From the moment a child was born in Scandinavia, life itself became a teacher. No one promised comfort. No one expected nature to be kind. The winters would be cold. Storms would come. Harvests would sometimes fail. The sea would take lives. Accepting these realities did not make the Vikings pessimistic. It made them prepared. Preparation became part of their culture. Food was stored long before snow covered the ground. Ships were repaired before sailing season arrived. Tools were sharpened before they became necessary. Firewood was gathered months before freezing temperatures returned. Every season was spent preparing for the next one. Nothing was left entirely to chance. This mindset created resilience that many other societies struggled to match. When disaster arrived, the Vikings were rarely surprised. They had already imagined difficult times. They had planned for them. This ability to think ahead became one of their greatest advantages. Their relationship with nature also set them apart. Many civilizations tried to reshape the world around them. The Vikings first tried to understand it. They watched the tides, studied the winds, learned the habits of animals, observed the changing seasons with extraordinary attention. Nature was never viewed as an enemy to conquer. It was a force to respect. Those who respected it survived. Those who ignored it often paid a heavy price. Another secret lay in the way they viewed knowledge. Knowledge was never considered complete. Every journey offered something new to learn. Every mistake became a lesson. Every stranger might possess useful information. Curiosity remained alive throughout Viking society. That curiosity carried them across rivers, seas, and eventually entire oceans. It also protected them from becoming trapped by old habits. Whenever circumstances changed, they asked practical questions. What works? What no longer works? What should we improve? What should we leave behind? These questions kept Viking society moving forward, while others sometimes remained tied to traditions that no longer served them. Their communities also played a vital role. No farmer survived entirely alone. No sailor crossed an ocean by himself. No shipbuilder created a long ship without the help of dozens of skilled craftsmen. Success belonged to groups rather than individuals. Trust became a form of wealth. Cooperation became a survival strategy. Communities capable of working together recovered from hardship much faster than communities divided by endless conflict. The Vikings understood this long before modern sociology would ever describe it. Perhaps their greatest strength, however, was psychological. They were remarkably comfortable with uncertainty. Most people fear the unknown. The Vikings trained themselves to face it. Unknown seas, unknown lands, unknown cultures, unknown futures. Every generation accepted uncertainty as part of life rather than something to avoid completely. That attitude encouraged exploration, trade, innovation, migration, adaptation. The very qualities that allowed them to survive Scandinavia also allowed them to expand far beyond it. Ironically, many of the famous Viking raids that dominate popular history represent only a small fraction of their true achievement. Raiding created fear, but adaptation created civilization. Ships carried warriors. They also carried merchants, families, explorers, ideas, technology, language, culture. The greatest legacy of the Vikings was not destruction. It was connection. They linked distant parts of Europe through trade, connected Scandinavia with the Islamic world through silver routes, reached the Byzantine Empire, crossed the North Atlantic, settled Iceland, colonized Greenland, reached the shores of North America centuries before Columbus. These accomplishments required much more than courage. They required planning, organization, engineering, observation, patience, and an extraordinary willingness to learn. As medieval Europe slowly recovered and transformed into stronger kingdoms, the Vikings changed with it. They became kings instead of raiders, merchants instead of pirates, settlers instead of conquerors. Their identity evolved because survival demanded evolution. History often celebrates civilizations that conquered the greatest territories, yet conquest alone rarely lasts. The civilizations that endure are those capable of changing without losing themselves. That is exactly what the Vikings accomplished. Even today, traces of their world remain everywhere. In the names of towns scattered across Britain, in words spoken every day in the English language, in archaeological discoveries buried beneath Scandinavian soil, in the stories preserved by Icelandic sagas, in the descendants of families whose ancestors once sailed across freezing seas in wooden ships. The Viking Age officially came to an end. The Viking influence never truly disappeared. Perhaps that is the final lesson their history offers. Survival has never belonged only to the strongest. It belongs to those willing to prepare before disaster arrives, to those willing to learn when circumstances change, to those brave enough to sail toward uncertainty while others remain safely in familiar waters. The Vikings were not immortal. They were not invincible. They made mistakes. They fought brutal wars. They experienced terrible losses. But they possessed one quality that repeatedly allowed them to recover. They adapted again and again and again. That was the real secret. Not the axe, not the shield, not even the famous longship. The true strength of the Vikings was the mindset that no matter how difficult tomorrow became, there was always another way forward. The hardest winter was their greatest teacher. Long before the Vikings became famous across Europe, they had already been fighting an enemy that no army could defeat: winter. Not the gentle winters experienced in many parts of southern Europe, but the brutal Scandinavian winter that transformed the landscape into a frozen wilderness for months at a time. The days grew shorter until the sun barely climbed above the horizon. Darkness lingered long after morning should have arrived. Cold winds swept across mountains and fjords, with enough force to freeze exposed skin within minutes. Rivers disappeared beneath thick layers of ice. Snow buried roads, fields, and forests beneath an endless blanket of white. Travel became slow. Fishing became dangerous. Farming came to a complete stop. Nature itself seemed to fall asleep. For many societies, such conditions would have meant disaster. For the Vikings, it became their greatest classroom. Every winter tested everything they had accomplished during the previous year. If enough food had not been stored, families faced starvation. If roofs had not been repaired before the first snowfall, freezing winds entered the house. If livestock had not been protected, months of hard work could disappear before spring arrived. Winter showed no mercy. It rewarded preparation and punished carelessness. This yearly challenge shaped Viking thinking more deeply than any king or warrior ever could. By autumn, every household worked with a sense of urgency. Barrels filled with dried fish lined the walls of storage rooms. Smoked meat hung above slow-burning fires. Grain was sealed carefully to protect it from moisture. Butter, cheese, and preserved foods were placed where they would remain usable throughout the long cold months. Every item represented security. Every full storage chest meant another chance to survive until spring. Firewood became as valuable as food. Entire families spent weeks cutting trees, splitting logs, and stacking them where snow could not easily reach them. The amount of firewood collected often determined how comfortably people would endure the coming winter. Too little meant freezing nights. Too much was never considered a problem. The Vikings always preferred preparation over regret. Inside the longhouse, life continued despite the weather outside. The central fire burned day and night. Its warmth filled the building, while smoke slowly drifted upward through openings in the roof. The smell of burning wood mixed with drying meat, damp wool, leather, and fresh bread. It was not luxurious, but it was alive. Families gathered around the fire during the long evenings. Children listened as elders shared stories of past winters that had seemed impossible to survive. They heard about great storms that destroyed entire fishing fleets, about years when snow remained on the ground long after spring should have arrived, about ancestors who survived because they refused to give up even when supplies ran dangerously low. These were not simply stories. They were lessons. Each tale carried practical wisdom hidden inside it. Never waste food. Never ignore changing weather. Never assume next winter will be easier than the last. Always prepare. Generation after generation, these ideas became deeply rooted in Viking culture. The long winter nights also encouraged craftsmanship. When fields lay frozen beneath snow, people turned their attention indoors. Blacksmiths repaired broken tools. Carpenters carved wooden bowls, furniture, and ship components. Women spun wool into thread and wove warm clothing that would protect families during future winters. Every hour remained useful. Even when nature seemed asleep, the Vikings continued working. Time itself became another resource. Nothing was wasted. This constant productivity strengthened their economy. By spring, many households possessed new tools, repaired equipment, stronger clothing, and improved supplies ready for another year. Winter had become a season of preparation rather than simply survival. Meanwhile, many medieval societies viewed winter mainly as a period to endure. The Vikings transformed it into an opportunity. Their animals also required careful attention. Cattle, sheep, goats, and horses represented enormous investments. Losing them during winter could ruin an entire family. Hay collected throughout summer had to last until fresh grass returned. Barns required constant maintenance. Animals weakened by hunger or illness received special care whenever possible. Healthy livestock meant milk, wool, transportation, labor, and future prosperity. Protecting them became essential. Winter also strengthened community bonds. Neighbors checked on one another after severe storms. Families shared news whenever travel remained possible. If disaster struck one household, nearby settlements often provided assistance because everyone understood a simple truth. Next year, they might need help themselves. Cooperation became another form of insurance. This habit of helping one another increased the resilience of entire communities. No written law forced people to care. Experience did. The Vikings knew that isolation during difficult times often led to tragedy. Unity increased everyone's chances of survival. Winter also shaped their personalities. Months spent indoors encouraged patience, planning, observation, storytelling, craftsmanship. Children learned self-discipline because there was little room for laziness when survival depended upon everyone's contribution. Adults learned endurance because quitting solved nothing. These qualities became part of Viking identity. When spring finally returned, something remarkable happened. The people emerging from their homes were stronger than before. Not because winter had been easy, because it had demanded growth. Every difficult season sharpened their skills. Every challenge increased their experience. Every hardship prepared them for the next one. Perhaps this explains why the Vikings remained remarkably calm during crises that overwhelmed others. They had already spent their entire lives practicing resilience. By the time they sailed across dangerous seas or entered unfamiliar lands, uncertainty no longer frightened them. Winter had already taught them the greatest lesson of all. The world would never become easier. So they became stronger. And that simple philosophy allowed them to survive generation after generation, while so many others struggled against forces they could neither predict nor control. Soon, however, the Vikings would discover that surviving nature was only one part of their story. The greatest challenges would come not from snow or storms, but from meeting entirely different civilizations with their own ideas, beliefs, and ambitions. The Vikings who built cities instead of destroying them. History remembers the flames. It remembers monasteries under attack. It remembers frightened kingdoms, watching longships appear on the horizon. Those moments were dramatic, and because they were dramatic, they were carefully recorded by the people who experienced them. But history is often written about extraordinary events, not ordinary life. The ordinary life of the Vikings tells a very different story. While some Viking expeditions gained fame through warfare, countless others quietly built towns that would continue growing long after the sound of battle had faded. That is the side of Viking history that receives far less attention. Imagine arriving at a busy Viking trading settlement during the height of the Viking Age. Long before you reach the harbor, you hear it. The rhythmic tapping of blacksmiths shaping glowing iron. The voices of merchants calling out prices, and several different languages, the laughter of children running between wooden buildings, the creaking of ships tied tightly along crowded docks, the cries of seabirds circling overhead in search of scraps. The smell reaches you next. Fresh fish drying in the sea breeze, smoke rising from workshops, newly cut timber, leather curing in the sun, bread baking inside ovens, tar being heated to waterproof ships. Instead of a battlefield, you find something else entirely. A marketplace. People from different cultures move through narrow streets carrying goods from places separated by thousands of miles. A merchant from the Baltic unloads amber. Another displays colorful glass beads brought from distant lands. Bundles of fine cloth change hands beside barrels filled with honey and wax. Fur traders negotiate prices, while craftsmen examine imported tools unlike anything they have seen before. This is not a society surviving through violence alone. It is a society connected to the wider world through commerce. The Vikings understood that permanent prosperity required more than successful raids. Loot eventually disappeared. Trade created wealth again and again. That simple truth transformed many Viking settlements into thriving commercial centers. One of the greatest examples was Dublin. Today, it is the capital of Ireland. But its growth began with a Viking settlement established along the River Liffey. What started as a seasonal camp gradually developed into one of the busiest trading towns in the region. Ships arrived carrying goods from Scandinavia, Britain, continental Europe, and lands much farther away. Merchants exchanged silver, textiles, slaves, weapons, livestock, and luxury goods. Over time, the settlement expanded. Wooden houses multiplied. Roads connected neighborhoods. Markets became larger. Families settled permanently. Children were born who had never seen Scandinavia, yet still carried Viking traditions within their daily lives. The same pattern appeared elsewhere. York, known to the Vikings as Jorvik, became one of the richest urban centers in northern England. Its streets echoed with many languages. Its craftsmen became famous for their skills. Its markets attracted traders from distant regions. Archaeological discoveries made centuries later revealed workshops filled with tools, jewelry, leather goods, combs carved from antlers, and countless objects reflecting an active and prosperous community. The Vikings had not simply occupied these places, they had invested in them. Building towns required patience. Roads had to be maintained, wharves repaired, warehouses expanded, markets organized, laws enforced. All of this demanded stability. A merchant would not return year after year to a place where constant violence threatened every transaction. Trust became essential. That trust allowed economic life to flourish. The Vikings became remarkably skilled at recognizing valuable locations, harbors protected from storms, river crossings linking inland communities, natural trading routes used for generations. Instead of settling randomly, they often chose places that naturally encouraged commerce. Geography became an ally. Once established, these towns attracted even more people. Blacksmiths moved there because customers were plentiful. Carpenters found steady work. Weavers sold cloth. Farmers nearby supplied food. Fishing communities delivered fresh catches daily. Success attracted more success. Prosperity encouraged further growth. This process resembled what economists today describe as positive feedback. The more successful a settlement became, the more reasons people found to move there. The Vikings may never have used such terminology, but they understood the principle through experience. Busy markets created opportunity. Opportunity created wealth. Wealth strengthened communities. These urban centers also became places where ideas traveled just as easily as goods. A craftsman arriving from the Frankish kingdoms might introduce unfamiliar woodworking techniques. An Eastern merchant could demonstrate new weighing systems. A traveler returning from Byzantium described magnificent cities unlike anything most Scandinavians had ever imagined. Knowledge moved from person to person across crowded marketplaces. Innovation spread naturally. Every visitor became a potential teacher. Every conversation carried the possibility of learning something useful. This openness made Viking towns surprisingly dynamic. Different cultures interacted daily. Languages mixed, customs blended. Religious beliefs gradually evolved. Children growing up in these settlements often developed broader perspectives than previous generations. They belonged to a world becoming increasingly interconnected. That world rewarded curiosity, not isolation. Not every Viking town survived forever. Some declined as trade routes shifted. Others suffered from war or changing political circumstances. Yet many left lasting foundations beneath modern cities still thriving today. Their streets have changed. Their buildings have changed. Their people have changed. But their origins remain connected to those early Scandinavian settlers who recognized that building lasting communities offered far greater rewards than endless destruction. Perhaps that is one of history's greatest ironies. The civilization remembered for its raids also helped create some of Northern Europe's most important commercial centers. Their greatest victories were not always won with swords. Many were won with marketplaces, shipyards, workshops, and the quiet determination to build something that future generations could inherit, because true survival is measured not only by staying alive, it is measured by creating a future strong enough to outlive you. And that was something the Vikings understood remarkably well. The Vikings who traded with the world. When most people hear the word Viking, they imagine warriors carrying axes, shields hanging from the sides of long ships, and villages trembling at the sight of sails appearing on the horizon. Yet there was another Viking, one who carried no battle axe, one whose greatest weapon was not strength, but negotiation. These were the merchants. Without them, the Viking world could never have survived. Trade was not a small part of Viking life, it was one of its foundations. Every successful settlement depended on a steady flow of goods moving across rivers, seas, and continents. The farther the Vikings traveled, the more they realized that wealth did not always have to be taken by force. Sometimes it could be earned. And wealth earned through trade often lasted much longer than wealth gained through war. A successful raid might fill a ship once. A successful trade route could fill hundreds of ships over generations. The Vikings understood that difference. As spring returned each year, merchant ships prepared for journeys that could last weeks or even months. Unlike raiding expeditions, these voyages carried carefully selected cargo, bundles of valuable animal furs collected during the winter, amber gathered from the Baltic coast, iron produced by skilled Scandinavian blacksmiths, walrus ivory carved into beautiful objects, honey harvested from forests, beeswax used for candles across Europe, timber cut from the endless northern forests, Every item represented labor. Every item represented opportunity. The destination often depended on the season. Some ships sailed toward England. Others crossed the Baltic Sea. Many traveled deep into Eastern Europe using vast river systems that connected one civilization to another. The rivers became highways. Sometimes the crews reached places where the water became too shallow for sailing. Instead of turning back, they pulled their ships across land. Heavy vessels slid over wooden logs while dozens of men worked together. It was exhausting, but it allowed them to continue their journey. Obstacle after obstacle was solved through determination. Eventually, these river routes connected Scandinavia with one of the richest cities in the medieval world. Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Byzantine Empire. For many Vikings, arriving there must have seemed almost unbelievable. The city was enormous. Its walls stretched for miles. Its churches towered above crowded streets. Markets overflowed with silk, spices, jewelry, wine, glass, perfumes, and luxury goods, unlike anything found in Scandinavia. The Vikings called the city Miklagard, the great city. The name alone reflected their admiration. Many visitors returned home with stories that sounded almost impossible. Buildings covered in marble, golden domes shining beneath the sun, crowds larger than entire Scandinavian regions, markets filled with products gathered from Asia, Africa, and Europe. These experiences changed the Vikings, not because they abandoned their own culture, because they realized how vast the world truly was. Trade also carried them farther east. Silver coins from the Islamic world poured into Viking markets through commercial networks stretching across thousands of miles. Archaeologists have discovered enormous collections of these coins buried throughout Scandinavia. Some still bear Arabic inscriptions. These discoveries reveal something extraordinary. The Vikings were connected economically to civilizations most medieval Europeans knew only through rumor. Their trade networks stretched farther than many kingdoms. Merchants became messengers between worlds. They carried products, ideas, stories, technology, religion, fashion, knowledge itself. Every voyage expanded the Viking understanding of distant societies. Some travelers learned foreign languages. Others became experts in negotiating with unfamiliar cultures. The ability to communicate peacefully became just as valuable as knowing how to fight. This balance between strength and diplomacy made Viking merchants remarkably successful. They understood that different cultures valued different things. What seemed ordinary in Scandinavia could become precious elsewhere. What appeared exotic abroad often found eager buyers back home. Recognizing these differences created profit. It also encouraged curiosity. Merchants constantly asked questions. What do these people need? What do they produce? What can we exchange? Where are the safest routes? Who controls this territory? Knowledge became as valuable as cargo. Every successful trader developed an impressive understanding of geography, politics, economics, and human behavior. Many probably never considered themselves scholars, yet their experience gave them an education few others possessed. Travel transformed perspective. A Viking returning from distant lands no longer viewed the world as a collection of isolated villages. He had seen mighty empires, foreign religions, different governments, new technologies, unfamiliar customs. That broader understanding strengthened Viking society. New ideas entered Scandinavia alongside imported goods, improved tools, different artistic styles, advanced metalworking techniques, fresh approaches to construction. Innovation often arrived quietly, inside the cargo of merchant ships. Little by little, Viking communities absorbed useful knowledge from every direction. This willingness to learn became another reason they survived. Pride never prevented them from adopting something better. If another culture developed a more effective solution, the Vikings paid attention. Practicality always outweighed stubbornness. Trade also reduced conflict. Not everywhere, not always. But merchants understood a simple truth. A peaceful customer is usually worth more than a defeated enemy. Long-term partnerships created reliable income. Reliable income strengthened communities. Strong communities supported future voyages. Commerce became another form of security. It protected Viking society from becoming dependent on any single source of wealth. Some years, farming produced excellent harvests. Other years, trade compensated for poor crops. Flexibility remained their greatest advantage. By connecting Scandinavia with distant civilizations, the Vikings created one of the medieval world's most impressive commercial networks. They became explorers of markets as much as explorers of oceans. Their ships carried more than merchandise. They carried civilization itself from one shore to another. And as these trade routes expanded across Europe and beyond, something unexpected began to happen. The people who had once been feared as outsiders slowly became indispensable partners in the growing economy of medieval Europe. The Vikings were no longer simply surviving. They were helping shape the future of an entire continent. The legacy that outlived the Viking Age. Every age eventually comes to an end. Empires rise, kingdoms expand. Powerful rulers believe their influence will last forever. Yet history has a way of reminding humanity that nothing remains unchanged. The Viking Age was no exception. By the late 11th century, the great era of Viking expeditions had largely faded into history. The famous longships no longer appeared on distant shores with the same frequency. Scandinavian kingdoms had become more organized. Christianity had become firmly established across the north. Trade replaced many of the old raiding traditions, while stronger European kingdoms developed defenses capable of resisting attacks that had once seemed unstoppable. To many observers, it appeared that the Vikings had disappeared. But history tells a different story. They had not disappeared. They had become part of the world they had once transformed. That was always the Viking way. Adapt, learn, move forward. Generation after generation. The descendants of Viking settlers became farmers, merchants, kings, craftsmen, explorers, scholars, and builders. The descendants of Viking warriors stood in royal courts instead of raiding monasteries. The descendants of Viking shipbuilders continued constructing vessels that connected northern Europe with the rest of the world. The descendants of Viking traders helped expand commercial networks that stretched across continents. Their identity changed. Their influence remained. Even today, traces of their civilization surround us. Thousands of English words still carry echoes of Old Norse. Place names across Britain, Ireland, Iceland, and beyond preserve the memory of Scandinavian settlements. Ancient rune stones still stand beneath open skies, silently telling stories carved by hands that disappeared centuries ago. Archaeologists continue uncovering ships, homes, tools, jewelry, and everyday objects that reveal not only how the Vikings fought, but how they lived. That may be the greatest correction modern history has made. For generations, the Vikings were remembered almost entirely through stories written by the people they attacked. Those accounts emphasized destruction, fear, violence, and understandably so. Communities that survived raids rarely celebrated the people responsible. But archaeology revealed another side. It revealed farms carefully planned for survival, workshops filled with skilled craftsmanship, busy marketplaces connecting distant civilizations, families raising children, communities solving practical problems together, a society far more complex than legend alone had suggested. The Vikings were never simply raiders. They were survivors. Their success did not come from strength alone. Strength eventually fades. Their success came from preparation. Preparation outlasts power. They accepted that nature could never be controlled. So they learned to understand it. They accepted that change could never be stopped. So they learned to adapt. They accepted that knowledge could come from anyone. So they kept learning. Again and again. Generation after generation. That mindset carried them across freezing seas, built settlements where few believed people could survive, connected cultures separated by thousands of miles, reached North America centuries before most Europeans imagined such a voyage possible, shaped kingdoms, influenced languages, expanded trade, and quietly helped create the medieval world that followed. Perhaps the greatest lesson the Vikings leave behind has nothing to do with axes, shields, or famous battles. It has everything to do with resilience. Throughout history, civilizations have faced disasters that seemed impossible to overcome. Climate changed, harvests failed, diseases spread, political systems collapsed. Wars reshaped entire continents. Some societies resisted every change until they broke apart. Others accepted reality, adapted, and endured. The Vikings belonged to the second group. They understood that survival rarely belongs to the strongest. It belongs to those willing to change before change becomes unavoidable. That lesson remains just as valuable today as it was 1,000 years ago. Modern societies possess technologies the Vikings could never have imagined. Yet humanity still faces uncertainty. Economic crises, environmental challenges, political instability, rapid technological change. The details are different. The principle remains the same. Preparation matters. Curiosity matters, community matters, adaptability matters. The Vikings never believed tomorrow would automatically be easier than today. Instead, they prepared themselves to meet whatever tomorrow might bring. Perhaps that was their greatest achievement. Not conquering distant shores, not discovering unknown lands, not building remarkable ships, but creating a culture capable of facing uncertainty with courage instead of fear. When medieval Europe struggled through famine, political instability, and repeated conflict, the Vikings were far from perfect. They suffered losses. They experienced hardship. They fought brutal wars. They buried loved ones. They endured disasters. Yet they continued adapting. That simple habit allowed them to outlast challenges that overwhelmed many others. History often remembers the loudest moments, the battles, the kings, the dramatic victories. But civilizations are not built in a single day. They are built through countless ordinary decisions repeated over generations. A family storing enough food before winter. A craftsman improving a ship one small piece at a time. A merchant choosing trade Instead of violence, a parent teaching a child the skills needed for survival, those quiet moments shaped the Viking world far more than any famous battle ever could. And perhaps that is why their story still fascinates us. Because beneath every legendary tale lies something deeply human. The desire to survive, to explore, to build, to leave the world stronger than it was found. The Viking Age ended. The Viking spirit of resilience did not. It sailed beyond history itself,